just look at Aladdin from the nostalgic standpoint is a perfectly acceptable way to do things, of course. Just reviewing something would be quite nice, and we are certainly going to do that. But this isn't just something. Disney's Aladdin was one of the best-selling games of the entire 16-bit era, achieving way more than a licensed game usually would. And the story behind the game in and of itself is amazing, to see how it evolved into something that truly showed just what a quality licensed game could be. It almost never happened, and frankly it's a wonder that it ever did. Hell, there's even a healthy competition with a SNES game by Capcom that seems to get more and more love as the years go by. It is funny, no less a figure than Shinji Mikami, who worked on the SNES Aladdin, has indicated his preference for the Mega Drive game. David Perry, the brains behind a big chunk of the Mega Drive game, for contrarian reasons perhaps, he's attached his colours to the SNES game. So yeah, who knows on that front. Still, we are going to be looking at the Sega game here, and we can't not start with the company who made it all possible in the first place. Now, obviously we don't need the full Disney history or anything. It's not like these guys are some tiny little software house operating out of Sunderland. What we need to know is, well, how they felt about games. Ocean Software's David Ward, who knows as much about licensed games as anybody, was quite negative about Disney, saying that he'd never work with them because they were too controlling, you made virtually nothing working with them, and that they didn't understand the gaming business. How true is that though? There are a lot of Disney licenses, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and it has to be said that a lot of them are very good indeed. There's games like DuckTales, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, Castle of Illusion. There's games that would rank high amongst the best licensed games ever. And to be honest, the worst you could say about a lot of Disney games is that the weakest of them are usually just a trifle mediocre. So maybe it's fairer to say that Disney, as they usually did, administered a lot of quality control. The heart of the classic Disney ethos is that their products are at the highest end possible. There is no children's entertainment better than them. They purposefully keep the availability of these products limited, especially back in the late 80s and 90s. Home videos would go out of print sharpish so that the films could continue to be shown in cinemas. Anything that potentially harms this image is a capital crime. And so presumably Disney wouldn't just throw these licenses off to just anybody. And yes, they would control it. And it wasn't long until other people started doing the same with their licenses, in the case of Steven Spielberg and what have you. Still, it's not like Disney took a direct role in the creation of the games once the license had been handed out. They were still in essence like everyone else, letting their stuff off to a third-party company. They were happy to rely on reputation and on the skill of the publishers and developers to interpret their characters how they saw fit. After all, it's not like they were going to get access to Disney's art assets or anything like that. I mean, such a thing was unthinkable. However, this started to change in the early 90s. What happened? I mean, who was to blame? Well, Sega. Now you might think of Castle of Illusion and be shocked, but don't. That had nothing to do with it. This piece of shit was at fault. I've mentioned Fantasia a couple of times because it's easily one of the worst Mega Drive games ever made, but this game, one that Sega fobbed off to Infogrames to develop, also massively fucked off Disney. I mean, it's Fantasia, the video release of which had been a ridiculous money spinner. Fantasia is Disney's be-all and end-all product. It is classic Disney animation at its peak, regarded as one of the greatest films ever, let alone just animations. The ultimate cinematic spectacle, and it gets this shitty game that everybody hated? Don't think that Disney didn't notice. They were mortified, especially because it had slipped totally under their radar, and the first time that they saw that the Fantasia game was just completely unfinished and flat out awful was, well, around the same time that any poor sod who bought it did. They felt keenly that Fantasia wasn't just a blemish on Sega, but a blemish on Disney itself that went against all that they aspired to be. This would not stand, and Disney wanted to be sure that something like Fantasia would not be repeated again. From now on they would put even more focus on their games, and even more control and monitoring. I mean, it's not like you could blame them. Sega's relationship with Disney just about survived thanks to the success and high quality of both Quackshot, which quickly followed Fantasia, and later on the brilliant World of Illusion. and thanks to this, Sega were trusted with handling the development of the game for what Disney had already picked as their biggest cinematic release in many years. The second wave of Disney's dominance was about to go into full swing with the arrival of Aladdin. Disney's deadline for Aladdin could not be more strict. The game must coincide with the film's release on home video, and if it doesn't, then there will be grave consequences. And this was not to be just another licensed game. Disney demanded that Aladdin be marketed and advertised with as much power and as much money behind it as a Sonic title would usually have. Sega understood this perfectly, and they agreed to it. But if there's one demon that they could never quite shake despite all of the success, it's their lack of organisational sense. They put the project in the hands of Blue Sky Software, unquestionably one of their best affiliated studios, a strong and highly dependable software house who'd done Disney before, working on the Sega version of The Little Mermaid, as well as the second entry into the ever-popular Joe Montana Sports Talk series of football games. They had a pretty good reputation and they could certainly do the job. However, well, something got in the way. That being that Blue Sky already had the license to the biggest cinematic release of 1993. Blue Sky failed to do any kind of job on Aladdin, primarily because most of their resources were spent working on the game for Jurassic Park. Aladdin was being worked on, but it was undoubtedly being worked on by the company's Second 11. When Disney popped their heads around the door to monitor how the game was going, well, they were dismayed. The Blue Sky Aladdin apparently was, well, just a rather generic platformer. It didn't share anything remotely similar to the art style of the film, and hardly followed on from it. A serviceable game, possibly, in all likelihood not another Fantasia, but Disney didn't want serviceable, they wanted brilliant, and this wasn't it. Disney pulled the project from Blue Sky, and indeed basically pulled the development side from Sega in all but name at this point. They would find a software house that would get the job done themselves. Very little evidence of Blue Sky's Aladdin exists, but there is an Easter egg in the Jurassic Park game that would eventually get released. A range of mountains on the Isla Nublar map that looks suspiciously like an upside-down genie's lamp. So at this stage we are around about 7 months away from the deadline, and Disney have no game in development and no software house to develop it. They took the unexpected decision to have their feature animation team start to actually work on aspects of games under the Disney license, such as art and character animation, which sorted out that problem at least, because hell, you can't go on with Disney animators. Still, someone needed to do all the coding and level design and stuff, and that someone would be Virgin Games. To put Disney's own animation into another person's hands could be seen as unthinkable for a company that is as famously possessive of their assets as Disney are, but if they wanted to take a more hands-on role in the development of their game, it's something that they'd have to do. And Virgin weren't a bad choice at all. They had David Perry on the books, along with other highly skilled designers and programmers, and they'd already got a reputation with some well-praised and successful platformers. Cool Spot is undoubtedly the most famous of them and would actually provide, in part, the engine that powered Aladdin, but apparently the game that actually caught the attention of Patrick Gilmore, a producer at Disney, was Mick and Mac as the Global Gladiators, a rather successful McDonald's tie-in jobby that's about as 90s a platform game as you can possibly get. Virgin were also working on a tie-in game for the Jungle Book already, and Disney were quite pleased at how that was progressing. Still, sod that. After Virgin were able to convince Disney of their ability to create a good game and successfully transfer Disney's hand-drawn art and animation to the Mega Drive, well, they could drop all that shit because they were working on Aladdin. The deadline was in 6 months. It still sounds like a recipe for a major disaster. 6 months is scarcely enough time to produce any game, let alone a state-of-the-art platformer with hand-drawn animation that's also positioned to be one of the biggest marketing drives in the history of the console. But no one was above this project, certainly not anyone at Disney. The demands for Aladdin were laid out by no less a figure than Jeffrey Katzenberg himself, the then chairman of Disney, one of the main figures responsible for their renaissance, and soon after the co-founder of DreamWorks, who handled the QA for the game. Disney Feature Animation would do what they do, and Virgin would code the game, and the whole thing would fall under a co-production between Virgin Games and the Disney software label. When you think about crunch periods in this industry, this sounds like the video game equivalent of Hannibal crossing the Alps. How can a good game possibly come from this? So let's look at the game itself. Obviously we know that a good game did indeed come from it all, that's not much of a spoiler, but when you know about just how little time the developers had to create the game, to see what they did is incredible. I'm still not sure if there's any game, relatively speaking, that wowed me quite as much as this one did. It looks like the movie, simple as that. Everything is so beautifully drawn and outrageously smooth. A lot of that is down to sheer hard work, but also down to, in the end, a very good collaboration. The team leaders at Virgin were intimidated at first when they suddenly had Disney animators, usually perceived to be the world's very best, at their command, but they were more than happy to take direction, and more than anything else they were intrigued about the differences between what they usually did for a film and how animation would work for a video game. And Virgin kept up their end of the deal too. They were able to take that beautiful animation and bring it to the screen. David Perry created a process called Digicel that was able to compress Disney's hand-drawn animation into a form that would be suitable for the Mega Drive without utterly compromising the quality. Everything about Aladdin feels like something you wouldn't normally expect on the Mega Drive, whether it's that animation, or the speech samples and the like that are absolutely crystal clear, or the levels themselves. They are in many ways quite unconventional, with ground that occasionally feels almost one to be moving on, particularly in something like the desert or the Cave of Wonders. You see similar design at work in the earlier Cool Spot, but here it's ramped up to 11. There's a fair bit of smoke and mirrors at work in some places, and sometimes things can perhaps get a bit too weird hitbox-wise. But the question is the occasionally odd hitboxes and what have you worth it just for how these levels look? For me the answer is yes. Something like the Cave of Wonders level in particular might be a bit of a pain, but my god does it look like something else. And it certainly stands out when you look at other Western games that usually got a reputation for looking quite diffused, with subtle colouring that made things look kind of flat. And then there is this vivid, beautiful, multicoloured masterwork. It's like a different league. At the game's best in levels like the prison and the genie's lamp, it's virtually without equal on the system. The amount of creativity here is more than enough to outmatch any possible technical niggles or the frustration that can cause, because make no mistake, the game is quite tough even without the possibility of, say, falling through a platform because the hitbox is a little off. Again, it helped a ton that Disney were that little bit more open towards Virgin, allowing them a decent amount of controlled access to assets and to the movie, and that helped the level design out no end. It's interesting to compare it to the SNES Aladdin by Capcom, which by the way exists because the Kappas still had a multi-year deal with Disney to produce licensed games for Nintendo consoles. Conventionally, in terms of classic video game level design, it's arguably the better made game and it's not bad at all in its own right, but it's nowhere near as memorable, is nowhere near as accurate a representation of the movie, and in many ways it's probably a lot like the game that Blue Sky would have eventually put out if they'd been kept on the project. And despite everything, the Mega Drive game does stay solid till the end, with good levels throughout as opposed to being all packed in at the front. Are there other problems? Yeah, the odd one here and there. The game lacks a little in set pieces, likely for time reasons. There's not all that much in the way of a good boss fight, for example, and it's not usually worth doing a lot of exploring in levels because you won't find much beyond the main path. The cutscenes in between levels are also that little bit underwhelming once you know the story. There was actually a major plan to do some proper-ish cutscenes in between levels, perhaps similar to what you'd eventually see in the later Lion King game, but this was nixed as there just wasn't enough time, and so the whole thing was done with text instead. Which is fine of course, even if there could have been an amazing alternative. And some levels are indeed right bastards. I mean, the escape kinda says it all really. A beautiful looking but frustrating nightmare that throws the difficulty curve right into a brick wall. But this is what two teams, suddenly at the height of their powers, produced in 6 months. It's interesting to think just what they could have done with a year. If that would have pushed the game to even greater heights, or if this particular game just needed that monster rush. With the big pressure that Disney piled onto the project, there's only two ways this game could have really gone, and the likeliest was that the whole thing could have been an utter catastrophe. Conventional wisdom almost demands that. And yet, it was the rarer opposite. A brilliant creation by a bunch of very stressed, no doubt, but very creative and determined people. A triumph that fit the film perfectly. Disney had the game they wanted. Everyone had the game they wanted. And it was, of course, a roaring success. Aladdin sold around 4 million copies on the Mega Drive, making it the third biggest selling title for the console behind Sonic's 2 and 1, and obviously the first Sonic is helped out by being the pack-in title. Reviews were magnificent, and the money was good. Well, for Disney mostly. It's often said that Sega in particular didn't make all that much out of the whole deal if anything, but they didn't mind too much as they were greatly appreciative of the exposure and the fact that Aladdin sold a whole bunch of machines. Disney would repeat the whole thing again with Virgin, working with their Westwood Studios team to produce the game of The Lion King. Once again it had cracking animation and looked staggering, and it also came out on the SNES this time around as Capcom's deal with Disney finally ran out. A great game in many ways, although the design is quite a bit worse than Aladdin and the game is phenomenally hard, often for the wrong reasons. Still a success though. Westwood were a good team in their own right, although not the same people by and large who'd worked on Aladdin. David Perry & Co left Virgin shortly after the release of Aladdin and would form a new company called Shiny Entertainment. The work that Virgin's former coders did on Aladdin, not to mention the earlier games like Cool Spot, is clearly very prevalent and very influential on their own smash hit platformer, Earthworm Jim. Unfortunately, Disney's flirtation with proper in-house game production didn't last all that long beyond The Lion King, really. Despite renaming Disney Software as Disney Interactive in 1994, the studio's staff was cut in 1997, effectively ending in-house game production and going back to the older third-party model, albeit with a much sweeter deal for them. The studio is still credited on all of the licensed games released under Disney's umbrella, but in the most major cases it doesn't do all that much work. Something like Kingdom Hearts, for example, is almost entirely the creation of Square, just using Disney's characters and properties. There were other 2D platformers before 1997 along the same lines as Aladdin and The Lion King, although it's doubtful that quite as much intense work went into these ones. Still, Hercules on the PS1, for example, is definitely worth playing, and you can see influence from Aladdin there too. There's also the games that were made by Traveller's Tales, such as the absolutely brilliant Mickey Mania, and the ultra-hard but still very playable late 16-bit game of Toy Story. In the end, Aladdin is a great example of what good can come of an older company from another field deciding, for however short a time, to embrace something new. It's also a great look at how things were changing in the old, not exactly quality-assured world of licensed games. This and Jurassic Park show that studios were no longer willing to accept any old crap, and they'd go to pretty big lengths to actually ensure that. There's things that Disney did with the Aladdin game, access that they offered people, that old Walt himself might have found unthinkable. But it worked. And even if this period didn't last all that long and, obviously there were still plenty of crap licensed games around, there were still at least a few more good, even great ones. Bye for now. Thanks for watching my documentary cum review of Aladdin. If you like it, then please consider subscribing, and you can also consider following me on my social media and supporting me on Patreon. I would like to put in a special thanks before we start the whole Champions thing to Ken Horowitz of Sega 16 for his fantastic article on Aladdin, an invaluable resource in making this video. I will put a link in the description below, and you should go ahead and read it, and indeed just go ahead and read Sega 16 in general, the best goddamn site on the Mega Drive on the internet, full stop. Right, okay, let's get this old show on the road. Taylor Almond, Lee Norris, Gray from Blackpool. Thank you so much for your support. Yeah, thanks so much for your brilliant support as usual. What could we do without you? And of course there are other Patreons who deserve plenty of thanks, so here we go. Mark Johnson, Mark Johnston, Tim Lintz, Robert Kelly, Mike Siegler, Mike Spooner, Edge Reader, Russell Hugo, Gerard Morris, Paolo Leary, Graham Kamak, Scott Mitten, Nicole Ketchum, Mark Brooks, The Ninth Demon, Peter Sidon, Ludwig Holmstrom, John Ezell, Kit Leary, Elle O'Brien, Dave Parkinson, and Olaf Albine. Thank you so much, thank you to all my patrons, and if I mispronounced your name then, don't hesitate to let me know. The next video, as usual, will be next Monday, and I just have a question for all of you who've been hanging on till right at the end of the video. Are you ready? Let me know in the comments, because on April the 18th, it's time to play the game. And that's all for now. Wherever you are, whoever you be, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.